Welcome to the deep dive. I've really been looking forward to this one. Today, we're diving into the nature of reasons for action. This is something that I think we encounter all the time, right?
Right.
From like our everyday choices all the way up to these really complex ethical dilemmas. We've got some great material to guide us here. Excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guessed it, reasons for action. So think of this as I guess you could say, a carefully curated exploration of these core concepts. And I think it's safe to say some pretty lively philosophical debates, all designed, of course, for someone with, a philosophical mind like yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're really aiming for in this deep dive is to sort of unpack these distinctions, these different kinds of reasons for action that philosophers are always going on about. We want to kind of look at their underlying nature, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
And see how they connect to our motivations and even, how we justify our choices.
Mm.
Basically, we're going to try to provide a structured and hopefully insightful look at this concept that really underpins so much of, well, philosophical inquiry, doesn't it?
Absolutely. All right, so let's get into it. The first thing we should probably tackle here is normative reasons.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about here? Like when we say normative reasons, what do we, as, fellow philosophers, what should we really take that to mean?
Yeah. Well, I think a good way to think about it is it's basically like T.M. Scanlon, the philosopher, puts it. A normative reason is a consideration that counts in favor of someone acting in a certain way.
Yeah.
So it's like a reason that, supports or justifies doing something. And these normative reasons, they have a couple of really crucial roles,
Yeah, for sure.
in our understanding of how we act and why we act that way.
Okay, so like one of them was, I remember deontic, and the other was
Yeah, deliberative.
deliberate. Okay, so what do those actually mean?
So the deontic role has to do with how these reasons, explain an action's deontic status, meaning whether we, ought to do it, whether we must do it, or whether we're just like allowed, permitted to do it. So if a reason supports an action, it gives us what we call a pro tanto reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which just means like a reason that holds to that extent. But of course, there can be, reasons against taking a particular action, like tons of them.
Right, right. Like, that classic thing where you have a joke that's potentially really funny.
Yeah.
Right, and that gives you a reason to tell it, but it also might, like, seriously embarrass somebody,
Oh, yeah.
and that gives you a reason not to tell it.
Exactly. You got this like tug of war of reasons. And so whether you, ought to tell the joke, like all things considered, depends on how those competing reasons like weigh up against each other. If like, the potential embarrassment, that's like weighs more than the humor, then, well, then you ought not to tell the joke. But if neither outweighs the other, then, well, you may tell it.
Right.
But, you're not obligated to tell it.
I see. Okay, so these normative reasons are basically, like, really important, right? For figuring out what we like, should, and shouldn't do.
Mm.
Okay, now what about that deliberative role? What is that all about? How does that fit in?
So the deliberative role has to do with how normative reasons are the sorts of things, right, that it's like appropriate to pay attention to, when we're trying to decide what to do.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about whether to tell that joke, you should probably consider its potential funniness, but you should also consider the potential for, embarrassment. And if the potential for embarrassment outweighs the potential for funniness, well, then hopefully your deliberation will lead you to, not tell the joke.
Okay, and this is where it starts to get really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because these normative reasons, the things that we should take into account, they have the potential, right, to become our motivating reasons.
Exactly.
These are the actual reasons why we end up acting a certain way.
Right. They can become the reasons for which we act. And that connection between what we should consider and what actually moves us to act is super interesting.
Totally, totally. So let's maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about, the fundamental nature of these normative reasons themselves. Like, ontologically, what are they? What are we even, like, talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, are we talking about subjective states like, feelings or beliefs? Or are we talking about like objective features of the world? What's going on here?
Right.
Well, while we might say something like your birthday is a reason to celebrate, right? Philosophers generally think that normative reasons are actually facts.
Okay.
The idea is that only something that's like actually the case can really support or justify an action. So it's the fact that it is your birthday, or like the fact that the weather will be pleasant. Those are the kinds of things that can be normative
That
reasons.
makes sense. Like, if the weather's going to be terrible, then, I mean, the nice weather is not really a reason to have a picnic.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Now, it is important to make a distinction that philosophers often make, which is between objective normative reasons and subjective ones.
Okay.
Sometimes subjective reasons are called like apparent reasons. But I mean, our focus here is really on objective reasons, right? These are the like actual facts that like count for or against acting, like the kinds of considerations that a like a fully informed, rational advisor would, take into account. Subjective reasons, on the other hand, well, those have more to do with like what an agent believes. And, that might not always line up with the actual facts.
Oh, so like if I believe that there's like an amazing bottle of wine at a friend's house,
Yeah, yeah.
then that might be like my subjective reason for accepting the invitation, right?
Yeah.
Even if, unbeknownst to me, the wine's all gone, right?
Right. Exactly.
But the objective reason, well, I guess like if the wine is there, the objective reason would be the fact that it exists and, that it's like a good bottle.
Yeah, exactly. And although there's some debate about, the nature of facts themselves, right? I mean, are they like concrete things, abstract propositions? What's the deal with facts? I mean, that's a whole other can of worms.
Right.
But for our purposes here, we can comfortably call normative reasons facts. So, the next big question that we have to deal with is what makes a fact favor an action? Right?
Yeah.
Like, what is it about a fact that makes it a reason to do something? So what is the nature of this reason relation, as it's called?
Yeah, like how does the fact actually connect to the action?
Exactly. So some philosophers think that the idea of a reason is like primitive, right? It's like, you can't really break it down any further.
Okay.
It's just a fundamental concept. And maybe you can only explain it through like metaphors or something like, counting in favor of doing something. It might be a bit like trying to define goodness itself.
Right. Like it's just kind of like a foundational concept.
Yeah.
Exactly. You got it. But, some have tried to, give an account of this reason relation.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so one group of philosophers, they focus on the deontic role, right?
Okay.
They see reasons as being explanations of why you ought to perform an action. So John Broome, he talks about weighing explanations, right? So a reason is a consideration that plays this fore role in explaining the deontic status, right?
Okay.
Of an action.
Yeah, so it's like the reason is the justification for why, like when we consider everything, that's the thing that we should do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Now then you have like, other perspectives that kind of put more emphasis on the deliberative role, right? So they see normative reasons as, as facts that are appropriate and relevant to think about when we're actually like, in the process of deliberating.
Yeah.
So Bernard Williams, he argued famously that you have a reason to act only if you could arrive at that action through sound deliberation, starting from your existing motivations. So, what you already care about.
So like it has to kind of connect back to like what I already care about.
Right. So that's kind of the idea behind like internalism about reasons, right?
Yeah, okay.
But other philosophers in this camp, they take, maybe a broader view.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Linking reasons more generally to like, principles of rationality, good reasoning. So like the idea that a normative reason is something that would motivate you if you were like, perfectly rational.
Okay.
And fully informed.
So like an idealized version of myself.
Right. Exactly. And then we have the ends-based views, which understand reasons in terms of, their relationship to certain ends or goals. Right.
Okay.
And so this broad category kind of divides into, desire-based perspectives and value-based ones.
Okay. So I'm guessing desire-based means that like the reasons are anchored in my desires, in my subjective desires.
Right, exactly. So inspired by, Hume's work, these views suggest that a reason for you to act is a fact that helps to explain like how that action would contribute to achieving something that you desire.
Okay.
So, for example, the fact that, there's going to be like a really fascinating discussion at the philosophy conference, that's like a reason for you to attend if you have this like desire to engage in those kinds of discussions.
Right. So like my existing desire to, talk about philosophy, that connects that fact to me going to the conference. Right.
Exactly, exactly. And
Okay.
so then you have, value-based views. These are often associated with, people like Aristotle.
Yeah.
And these views kind of understand reasons in terms of achieving or promoting something that is, valuable. So on this view, a reason to act is a fact that explains how that action, how it would, lead to some valuable end, or, how it's otherwise related to, the good.
Right. So it's not just about what I happen to want, but about what is like actually good.
Exactly, right, right. So like the fact that, some policy would alleviate human suffering, a significant amount of human suffering, that's a reason to like support it, not just because you might, want to see that suffering reduced, but because human well-being is, it's often considered to have inherent value.
Right, right. And it's really interesting, like the source makes this point that a good account, right, of this reason relation, it should ideally be applicable not only to reasons for actions, but also to reasons for, beliefs, desires, and even emotions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It seems like this underlying relationship of like, favoring or supporting or something like that, it seems like it's there across the board.
Absolutely. So like, the fact that the evidence for a certain scientific theory is really strong, well, that can be, that can be a reason to believe it,
Right,
but it can also be a reason to like feel confident in its predictions.
right, right.
And so there's this, this common relationship of like support or justification that seems to hold across all those different, types of responses that we have.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So we've talked about all these different ways, right, of understanding normative reasons.
Hmm.
So how do these connect to other areas of philosophy?
Well, they connect in lots of really interesting ways, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, there's this big question about reasons and morality, right?
Okay.
So do we always have, like, a reason to do what morality requires?
Right.
I mean, this is a really, this is a tough question for those desire-based accounts of reasons that we talked about, right?
Right, yeah.
Because, I mean, sometimes moral actions, they might not align with what a person, desires.
Right.
So that's an interesting question. And then there's the connection between reasons and metaethics,
Okay.
right? This is, the study of the nature of normativity itself. So, can you analyze this, like this relationship of being a normative reason and, in just purely non-normative terms, like maybe even like naturalistic term. So, I mean, it's like asking, can we ground morality, in something other than moral principles?
Right, right.
That's kind of the idea. And then, of course, there's the very important connection between reasons and deliberation, right?
Right.
So how do these normative reasons like actually figure into our process of thinking about what we should do?
Right. Yeah.
And then, of course, there's this very complicated relationship between reasons and deonic status. So, like, how do all the reasons for and against an action, like, how do they combine
Right.
to determine what we ultimately ought to do,
Right.
what we may do? And so, it seems simple, right? You just kind of like weigh the reasons against each other, but it turns out it's way more complicated than that.
Right. Like that thought experiment, right, with Thomson's light switch.
Right, exactly.
Where, like flipping the switch has like this crazy consequence that you couldn't possibly have foreseen, right?
Yeah.
And it seems wrong to say that I shouldn't have flipped it,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
If I had no way of knowing.
Right. So cases like this, they lead some philosophers to propose like an epistemic constraint on normative reasons, right?
Mm.
And so what they say is like, look, a fact, it can only bear on what you ought to do if it's within your epistemic horizon. Like if you know it, if you could have reasonably known it, or if you, justifiably believe it, then it counts.
Yeah.
Right. So others kind of distinguish between like objective oughts
Yeah.
based on the totality of the facts
Mm-hmm.
and subjective oughts
Mm-hmm.
based on like what the agent knows.
Yeah.
So objectively speaking, maybe I ought not to have flipped the switch
Right.
because of that crazy lightning strike.
Rare freak lightning strike. Yeah.
But subjectively, I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
Right.
So it was totally permissible.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And like you said, right,
Mhm.
that metaphor of like weighing reasons, it it has limitations.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because it's not like they combine in this like straightforward additive way.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And their significance can like change depending on the context, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes, I mean, I guess they could even be like incomparable.
Totally. Totally. And then you have like this idea of silencing reasons.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the idea that like, sometimes a consideration, especially like a moral consideration, it can just like completely override other reasons rather than just outweighing them in a, like a cost benefit analysis.
Right. So it's a much more like nuanced and complicated picture than just a simple like scale,
Right.
right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay, so let's move on to motivating reasons.
Right.
So we talked about this a little bit, but these are the reasons like for which we actually act. These are the considerations that actually get us to do something. But it's really important to distinguish those from just any reason
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
that we might use to like explain our actions, like after the fact.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the source uses that example from Othello, right?
Mm.
Could you just quickly remind us how that illustrates this distinction?
Yeah. So Othello, he kills Desdemona
Right.
because he really believes that she's been unfaithful to him.
Yeah.
But, this is all like put in his head by Iago's lies. you know?
Yeah.
But so like his motivating reason for killing her, right, is this belief,
Right.
this very strong belief that he has about her infidelity. So, the fact that he has this belief, well, that kind of explains why he does this terrible thing, right?
Yeah.
But there's actually no like normative reason for him to kill her,
Right.
because I mean, in reality, she hasn't done anything wrong.
Right.
So we have like, a motivating reason, this belief,
Mm-hmm.
and an explanatory reason, also this belief.
Yeah.
But no normative reason for the murder.
Right. So the reason that like actually gets me to act might not be a good reason, right?
Practically, yeah.
Like in any objective sense, and it may not even like be true.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And also, when we talk about the motivating reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's often a simplification.
Right.
Because really our actions, they're usually driven by like a bunch of different considerations, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
my realizing that the house needs to be vacuumed, well, that might only motivate me to do it now if I also consider the fact that I'm not going to have time to do it later.
Right. Right.
And we can be motivated by multiple considerations at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Like I might decide to vacuum now because I won't have time later, but also because I know that like, my neighbor, it bugs them when I vacuum.
Right.
And they like to have quiet mornings.
Right. Right.
So,
Okay, so it gets pretty complex pretty quickly.
yeah, it totally does.
Right. And also the source, made this point that things like goals and intentions and desires, emotions, these things, that
Right.
they're not like strictly speaking motivating reasons.
Yeah.
Right. But they kind of form like the background, or there are the psychological states in response to which we have motivating reasons.
Exactly. Yeah. So like my desire for revenge, that's not like the motivating reason for my action, right?
Okay.
It's the thought that, that some person wronged me, right?
Right.
That thought kind of fuels that desire.
Right.
And that thought becomes like the motivating reason.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? It's the consideration, in light of which I choose to, act in a vengeful way. So, all right, so let's talk about like the ontology of motivating reasons.
Okay.
So what are these considerations that actually get us to act? What are they, like fundamentally?
Right.
And so there's this view called psychologism, right, which the source talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's the view that, motivating reasons are actually like mental states. Things like, beliefs and desires.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Donald Davidson, he was really famous for, defending this view
Right.
that intentional action is like, caused by a combination of this pro attitude, like a desire or valuing something, and a belief that the action is like a way to satisfy that.
You're right.
It has like a certain intuitive appeal, I think.
Yeah, it really does. It makes sense. Like I act because I want something, right?
Right.
And I believe that this action will help me get it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And it also kind of aligns with the idea that for a reason to motivate you, you have to be aware of it in some way, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to believe it.
Right, right.
But, there are a bunch of there are some, pretty convincing arguments that have led a lot of philosophers to kind of move away from this view of psychologism.
Okay, so what are some of the problems with this view?
Well, so, if we think about Othello again,
Mm.
right, when he's thinking about what he's going to do, even if he's like, really messed up in his thinking,
Yeah.
um, his thoughts aren't really on his own mental states, right?
Mm.
Like he's not focused on, the fact that he believes this or that.
Right.
He's focused on what he thinks are the facts of the matter about Desdemona's actions.
Right. Yeah.
So it's about like the world, not about,
Yeah.
what's going on in his head.
Right.
And another, really influential argument was made by Jonathan Dancy,
Okay.
and he calls it the normative constraint, right?
Mhm.
And so he says, look, a motivating reason, it has to be the kind of thing that could potentially be a reason in favor of acting, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it has to be able to play this normative role to justify the action.
Right.
But a mental state on its own, like, just a belief,
Yeah.
that's not really a fact about the world, right?
Right.
And so Dancy says, look, it can't meet this normative requirement.
So like my belief that it's raining isn't the same as the actual fact that it's raining.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. The fact is like a reason to take an umbrella, but just the belief like on its own isn't.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
The fact has this like, normative force, right?
Right.
That a belief, on its own doesn't have. Now, some people try to, tweak psychologism a little bit.
Okay.
And they say, well, maybe motivating reasons are psychological facts.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are facts about your mental states.
Okay.
But, while those are facts, they're usually not the kinds of things that
Yeah.
actually motivate us in our day-to-day actions.
Right.
So like my reason for taking an umbrella is usually about the rain itself, right?
Yeah.
Not about like, the fact that I believe that it's raining.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that makes sense. So psychologism, like, in its original form, it's kind of seen as inadequate, right?
Right.
So what are the main like alternatives? What are the views that people are kind of working with now?
Right. So the two big contenders now are factualism and propositionalism. Right?
Okay.
So factualism says that motivating reasons are facts.
Okay.
Just like states of affairs out in the world. But the big problem for factualism is those error cases, right?
Right.
Like Othello, we've been talking about him. So he acted on a false belief.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he wasn't really acting on an actual fact.
Right. So it doesn't really like account for those cases where, we act based on something that's not true.
Exactly. And so then, propositionalism tries to fix this problem, right? By saying that motivating reasons are their propositions.
Okay.
Right. These are things that can be, true or false.
Mm-hmm.
But the agent have to believe them. So in the case of Othello, his motivating reason would be the false proposition, Desdemona is unfaithful, which, he really believed, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that kind of solves that problem.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
But I remember the source mentioned a possible objection to this view, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So Peter Unger, he raised this objection, which is pretty influential.
Okay.
So he says, look, it just sounds really weird to say something like, his reason for not going to the store was that it was closed, but it wasn't actually closed.
Yeah.
Right? It seems like if his reason was, that P,
Mhm.
then P better be true, right?